Greetings, comrades, friends, sisters, and brothers. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 17. I am your host, Milton Alimadi. Today we look at Amilcar Cabral, the great revolutionary leader for independence in Guinea-Bissau. Cabral was an intellectual. He was a teacher. He was a very humble, learned man. And I would say he was one of the most theoretical and literate of all the leaders of the revolutionary movements in Africa. Portugal was one of the most brutal colonial European powers in Africa. I think if you count the number of massacres committed by European imperialism in Africa, Portugal should easily top all of the countries, even when you look at the atrocities committed by King Leopold or the Belgians in Congo, who is estimated to have exterminated as many as 10 million Congolese. Portugal had a far longer colonial experience in Africa, dating about 500 years. So it had time to commit many, many more massacres in all the territories that were conquered and colonized by Portugal. In Guinea-Bissau and in Cape Verde, which were also both Portuguese colonies, the resistance continued for a long time. In fact, the resistance in Guinea-Bissau did not end till 1936 to Portuguese colonial conquest. I'll give you an example of how brutal the Portuguese were. Under the Portuguese commander Teixeira Pinto in 1915, when one of the resisting kings in Guinea-Bissau, Kanande Ka, was eventually captured. And he refused to surrender. He said, "I will never surrender to the Portuguese." And this was after most of his people had been exterminated. He said, "Even if I meet Europeans in the afterworld, I will continue to fight against Europeans." And his name is spelled Nkanande, and then the second word is Ka, K-A. So he was tied on a stake. His eyes were plucked out. He was mutilated. And then he was buried alive. This is just one example of the many acts of barbarism by the Portuguese, who claimed they were out there to civilize Africans. And even much, much later, in the 1960s, when the War of Liberation was launched by the PAIGC, which is the name of the party that Amilcar Cabral founded, together with his brother Luis Cabral and other revolutionaries. Whenever the Portuguese killed fighters of the liberation struggle, they would decapitate them, particularly commanders, and then, of course, put the heads on spikes and plant it in front of the villages to terrorize the rural peasant farmers. And of course, the guerrilla fighters never committed any such similar acts of barbarity because they were disciplined and well trained and were on a singular mission which was to liberate their country from Portuguese rule. So Cabral is born in 1924, and he's given the name Amilcar, which is actually in honor to Hamilcar, the Carthaginian general who was also the father of another great Carthaginian general, Hannibal, and that is who he was named after. His father is a teacher, and his mother does a number of activities to generate income, including shopkeeping. And so reading was a very big part of his early childhood for Amilcar. Both his parents were from Cape Verde, which is just over 300 miles from the mainland African continent, where, of course, Guinea-Bissau is situated in West Africa. Now, Portuguese colonialism, in addition to being similar to other European powers, Germany, France, England, Belgium, Spain, Italy, was of course premised on white supremacy and the European civilizing mission in Africa. And the Portuguese added another twist to that called assimilado, which was that people of mixed ancestry, European and African, who were called mestizos, were regarded as quote unquote civilized, while the so-called pure Africans were regarded as the savages. So the Portuguese introduced this system of white supremacy superimposed on colorism. And that was an issue that became problematic during and even after the colonial era. And I'll talk a little more about that later on. So Cabral is born in Guinea-Bissau. He is an excellent student, and he does very well. He's on the top student in his high school. And he lives sometimes with his mother, sometimes with his father after his parents had divorced. But he wins an academic scholarship to go study in Portugal. So in 1945, as the World War II is ending, he goes to Lisbon. And of course, he encounters challenges of racism. He's a very humble, kind, intellectual person who is a big champion of reasoning and debates and arguments. And he's fortified and prepared for the challenges because his father had warned him that as a non-European, and even though you are officially on paper regarded as assimilado, or at least not pure African, you're non-European and you're still going to face racism. Your work is going to be scrutinized in a different way, so you must excel beyond the Europeans. And he does that in school. And when he encounters racism, he's inclined toward explaining why his aggressors were actually wrong and misinformed and ignorant. He is such a brilliant student that the dean of his school, ASI, the university where he's studying agronomy, asked him to tutor his own children. And in addition to that, he also starts tutoring Portuguese in working class neighborhoods in Lisbon, because that is just the nature of who Cabral was, a natural born educator, a natural born communicator and teacher. To give you a sense of the type of racist, white, supremacist environment that Portugal was, in 1936, Portugal had hosted a colonial exhibition where Africans from Guinea-Bissau were displayed living in recreations of their villages. Yes, this is in Portugal. And that exhibition lasted for several weeks. And you have Europeans coming to observe these Africans being exhibited. This is, of course, somewhat similar to an exhibition right here in the United States. It was more than an exhibition when Otabenga, Otabenga, who was from the Congo, was displayed in a cage in the Bronx Zoo, right here in New York City in 1906. Many Americans and many people around the world are probably not familiar with that episode. So this is the environment in Lisbon that Cabral finds himself in. But it is also in Lisbon that he experiences an uplift in his level of consciousness, and he increases his capabilities in terms of organizing skills, because he starts interacting with alliances that include socialist, communist, student activist, labor union organizers, liberals, and monarchists. And these groups are collectively opposed to the fascist regime then governing Portugal at that time. It was called as the New State. And the Prime Minister, Antonio Salazar, practically a dictator, ruled Portugal from 1932 until 1968, when he was incapacitated by a stroke, and the new state was in power until 1974 under the successor to Salazar, who was Caetano Marcelino. So this is where Cabral develops his skills. He also meets other African students from other African countries, particularly the other Portuguese colonies in Africa, Mozambique and Angola. So this is where he meets people like Agostinho Neto, also a student and a poet, who later on, of course, became the leader of the MPLA, which is the acronym for the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, and was later on to become independent Angola's first president. And they also develop their own African student activist organizations right there in Lisbon. They organize readings and bring learned individuals in history, geography, and anti-colonial activism. And they also deliver their own presentations. They have a newsletter where they publish their works. And Cabral was also a poet, in addition to writing about agronomy. So he also publishes many of his poems. One of them was called The Black Pearl. It's a very rigorous academic program. He is the only African student in his incoming class of 300 students. And by the third year of the program, only 28 students had survived. And of course, Cabral is one of those students. And during his study, he meets Maria Helena, and that is a Portuguese student, and they become married. So Cabral also reads, in addition to Marxism, Leninism, and socialism, he reads the literature of PanAfricanism. He reads the emerging literature of African American writers in the United States. So he develops a Pan-African consciousness and approach to his activism. And to Cabral, culture was always a very critical component in the liberation struggle. And he has many famous sayings and quotes. And one of my favorite is return to the source, sometimes return to the roots. And he believed that Africans, particularly the African intellectuals, the bourgeois class, the bourgeoisie, needed to re-embrace their Africanness in order to dispel that myth of white supremacy and to elevate their own African consciousness and to reintroduce themselves into the history that had been interrupted by European imperialism, but to rejoin that history on a plane determined and guided by Africans. So culture was always very important to Cabral. He had an occasion to return to Cape Verde before his graduation, and he operated a radio show on one of the local stations. And his show emphasized the importance of African culture and why African people should learn more about their culture and history, which had been suppressed by the Portuguese. Not surprisingly, the show was quickly canceled. And this is the time when the colonial authorities started paying much more attention to Cabral as a person whom they would have to probably deal with sometime in the future. So he returns to Portugal, and eventually he completes his dissertation in 1952. His father dies before he returns to Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde. He does, after a period of mourning, return to Cape Verde, and his wife was to follow him later. And they both end up working for the agronomy department in the colonial administration. Obviously, this is a newly graduated young man, and he needs to establish himself, and he needs to have some income. But a golden opportunity also presents itself while he's working for the colonial administration in agronomy. He is commissioned in 1953 to conduct a nationwide survey of the rural agricultural producers. So he, together with his wife, who is a forestry engineer, and 15 people who work under their supervision, conduct this nationwide survey. meeting peasant farmers all over the country. Cabral is able to learn their conditions, their living experiences, the exploitation they endured under the Portuguese regime. They were forced to pay what is sometimes known as head tax or hut tax. So the hut tax was for the building where they lived, and the head tax, of course, is the tax per individual. And obviously, they were compelled under penalty of severe punishment if they did not pay this tax. And that is how they were induced to produce agricultural commodities such as peanuts or to produce rubber for the Portuguese regime. That is the forced incentive that they had because they needed to earn income to pay for the taxes. They did not have choice as to what they wanted to grow. So Cabral is able to form a very good database and knowledge of the entire rural structure of Guinea-Bissau. Now, Cabral at this stage is still hopeful that independence might be able to achieved using peaceful measures, because he has seen what's happened in Ghana, where Kwame Nkrumah, after agitating and leading what he called positive action, non-violent but aggressive resistance, and non-cooperation by the British colonial regime, is able to become chief minister in Ghana after he was initially arrested and actually won his seat in parliament while incarcerated. The British realized Nkrumah was the man they needed to deal with. He becomes chief minister in the early 1950s, and he becomes prime minister when Ghana wins its independence in 1957. Of course, it had been called the Gold Coast during the colonial era, and it takes the name Ghana at independence after the great African empire that had covered much vast, larger territory in the past. So Nkrumah serves as an inspiration to Cabral. But Cabral realizes in 1959, after a massacre of dock workers and stevedores who had been demonstrating and were on strike, demanding for better wages and working conditions, and the Portuguese unleashed the armed forces, and 25 were killed in that massacre. It is named after the location of the incident and is called the Piggy Guiti Massacre, and I'll spell that for you. Pidjiguiti. And that massacre occurs in 1959. And it becomes clear to Cabral that nonviolent means was not going to achieve the objectives for Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. Cabral was one of the founding members of the PAIGC, which is the acronym for the Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. He was also a co-founder, together with people like Agostinho Neto of the MPLA, which fought for the liberation of Angola. Cabral attends the All African Peoples Conference in 1959 in Accra, Ghana. At this time, most African countries were still under colonial rule, even though decolonization had started. So countries such as Guinea-Conakry, for example, was independent under Ahmed Sékou Touré, who had been a union organizer and leader in Guinea-Conakry. So this conference is billed as a conference for the leaders of liberation movements throughout Africa. Cabral is able to meet leaders like Nkrumah, leaders like Sékou Touré. And these are the leaders whose countries provided the initial support to the PAIGC in terms of setting up the liberation movement. By 1960, when Cabral attends the second All-African Peoples Conference in Tunisia, he's now full-time involved in the liberation struggle for Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. He relocates to Guinea-Conakry, where he sets up headquarters, where he starts recruiting mobilizers to go and educate people in rural Guinea-Bissau in terms of what this liberation struggle would mean and would entail. And also in Guinea-Bissau, in Guinea-Conakry rather, he starts making contacts with the Cubans, with the Czechoslovakians, with the Soviet Union, with the People's Republic of China, in addition to Morocco, Algeria, and other African countries. So these are the countries that provide the initial support for the PAIGC in terms of training some of the mobilizers, in terms of training some of the guerrilla fighters, and in terms of starting to provide weapons for the PAIGC. And the first military action by the PAIGC occurs in 1963. And within 6 weeks, the PAIGC controlled 15% of the national territory, and by 1968, controlled more than 50%. But this is a drawn-out war and does not end until 1974. Cabral gets to meet Che Guevara in 1965, when Che Guevara visits Guinea-Conakry. And after this meeting, the Cubans start providing support for the PAIGC. In 1966, Cabral attends a meeting in Havana organized by Fidel Castro, and is called the TriContinental Conference. It brings activists and leaders of liberation struggle from Africa, from Asia, and from Latin America. And while in Havana, Fidel Castro is tremendously impressed by a speech that is made by Amilcar Cabral. And that speech is called The Weapon of Theory. And after listening to that speech, Castro said, the PAIGC is the liberation movement most likely to succeed in its aims of overthrowing colonialism in Africa. He was very impressed with the articulation of the vision provided by Cabral. And the Cuban support for the PAIGC increased after that conference. The Cubans sent more trainers and more technical advisors and experts in artillery, and provided some of the more sophisticated weapons that the PAIGC started to acquire for the liberation struggle. The Portuguese were very brutal in their own conduct. The Portuguese dropped napalm bombs indiscriminately, massacring villagers all over Guinea-Bissau. The Portuguese weapons, including the air jet fighters, were provided to Portugal as a member of NATO, and they were not authorized to use those weapons in its wars in Africa, but it used them nonetheless in violation of these restrictions. And the United States, who provided most of these weapons, turned a blind eye to the Portuguese atrocities because the United States leased the landing strips on the Azores Islands controlled by Portugal. So Washington did not want to upset that arrangement and therefore ignored Portugal's violations of the restrictions in terms of how these weapons could be used, and also ignored the human rights abuses by the Portuguese colonial regime. But the PAIGC was able to keep expanding its support internationally. It got the support of most African countries, and as more African countries became independent, the level of support to the PAIGC also increased. Cabral was also able to counter some of the Portuguese propaganda in Europe. Portugal tried to depict the struggle as a struggle between the West and communism, simply because Cabral got much of the training and weapons from the Soviet Union, the Czechoslovakia, and for the People's Republic of China, as if Cabral had a choice, as if the West had been willing to provide weapons to the PAIGC. Cabral was able to work with individuals such as Basil Davidson, the British journalist and historian, who had written a book denouncing Portugal's African colonies and the abuses by the Portuguese. Cabral later on had an opportunity to meet with Basil Davidson, and they formed a lifelong friendship. And Basil Davidson was able to go to some of the operational areas where the PAIGC was conducting its guerrilla activities and film some of them and make their activities known to the rest of the world. As late